There is a border on Earth that almost looks photoshopped. Fly over the island of Hispaniola and you'll see it immediately. A sharp line where green jungle suddenly turns into barren brown hills. On one side, resorts, airports, growing cities, a booming tourism economy. On the other, a collapsed government, armed gangs controlling the capital, and millions needing humanitarian aid. The shocking part? Nothing natural separates them. No ocean, no mountains, no climate difference. Just a border. One island split into two completely different destinies. Today we're going to break down how this happened and why the island of Hispaniola became one of the clearest real-world examples of how a nation can succeed and how they collapse. And the answer reveals something far deeper about how nations rise and how they fall. Let's start with what that border actually looks like on the ground. The Dominican Republic sits on the eastern two-thirds of the island. In 2025, it welcomed about 11.6 million tourists, more visitors than any other destination in the Caribbean. Its economy grew at 2.1% in 2025. Tourism alone generated more than $11 billion last year. New resorts are going up on the coastline. Highways are being expanded. The country's foreign currency inflows in 2025 exceeded $47 billion. Foreign investment is flowing in at a pace that the region hasn't seen in decades. Cross that border going west, and the world changes completely. Haiti occupies the western third. As of early 2026, armed gangs control an estimated 90% of the capital, Port-au-Prince. The country's transitional government lost its elected mandate in February of 2026. A UN-backed gang suppression force was authorized in late 2025, but it arrived underfunded, outnumbered, and struggling to make a dent. Over 6.4 million Haitians, more than half the country's population, need urgent humanitarian assistance. In 2025, over 1.4 million people were internally displaced, a 36% increase in a single year. The economy contracted by 3.1% in 2025. 600,000 people are in famine conditions, and it's still getting worse. Same island, same latitude, same hurricanes, same soil. So how does this happen? The answer doesn't start with politics. It does not start with economics. It starts with something much older, with what this island looked like before anyone decided to divide it. Before the island was ever split, before there were borders or nations or colonial flags planted in the sand, there was just a single civilization. The Taino people called the island Haiti, the land of high mountains. Scholars estimate that it supported a population of over 3 million people by the late 1400s. It was sophisticated. It was an organized society. 5 chiefdoms, communal agriculture, a culture of shared resources, and collective survival. Taino had no concept of territorial extraction. They worked the land to live, not to drain. And then 1492 arrived, and it shattered everything. Christopher Columbus landed, claimed the island for Spain, and within 4 years, the Spanish had built the first permanent European settlement in the Americas at Saint-Domingue. What followed for the Taino was a catastrophe. European diseases, smallpox, measles, typhus. They tore through a population that had lived in isolation for millennia and had no immunity to any of them. Combined with brutal forced labor in the gold mines and violent suppression of any resistance, the Taino population collapsed with terrifying speed. Within a generation, millions were reduced to a few thousand. Within 2 generations, they were essentially gone. So as the indigenous labor force vanished, the Spanish began importing enslaved Africans to replace them. But here's the thing about Spain and Hispaniola. Spain was never really that interested. Their big prizes were Mexico and Peru, the silver mines, the enormous populations, the real wealth of the empire. Hispaniola was a gateway that the Spanish would pass through, not a destination that they would invest in. By the early 1600s, the Spanish crown had essentially abandoned the western third of the island. A vacuum opened up, and France stepped into it. French buccaneers had been operating off the western coast for decades. The Spanish, too overstretched to push them out, eventually formalized the loss. In 1697, the Treaty of Ryswick officially gave France control of the western third, and what France proceeded to build there was extraordinary in its efficiency and monstrous in its method. French Saint-Domingue became the most profitable colony on Earth. By the late 1700s, it was producing 40% of all of Europe's sugar and 60% of its coffee. The plantation output was so staggering that the colony was nicknamed the Pearl of the Antilles. European fortunes were made here. French merchant cities grew fat on the trade. But that machine ran on human beings in the most brutal sense imaginable. The French imported enslaved people on a scale that the Spanish had never attempted. By the 1780s, 90% of the population of Saint-Domingue was enslaved. For every white French colonist, there were roughly 15 enslaved people, and the regime that controlled them was deliberately, systematically savage, because the math demanded it. The colony was not built for longevity. It was built to extract as much as possible, as fast as possible, before the whole thing collapsed. Life expectancy for enslaved workers was measured in years. They were worked to death and then replaced. Across the border, Spanish Santo Domingo was a different world. Poorer, quieter, less economically impressive, but with a looser social structure, more racial mixing, smaller land holdings, and a more sustainable, if modest, way of life. The eastern side never achieved the obscene profitability of its neighbor, but it also never built a society so violently unstable that its only possible future was revolution. The Spanish colony limped along on cattle ranching and subsistence farming. Yeah, it was poor, but it wasn't a pressure cooker. The French colony was both. Extraordinarily rich for a tiny elite, but a pressure cooker for everyone else. The gap between the two sides of the island was already wide before the 18th century ended. One was a neglected backwater. The other was the wealthiest colony on Earth, generating a third of all Atlantic trade, sitting on top of a powder keg with no escape valve. And then Saint-Domingue exploded. In 1791, the enslaved population rose up. What followed was 13 years of the most radical warfare in the Western Hemisphere. Under the leadership of Toussaint L'Ouverture and Jean-Jacques Dessalines, the rebels fought off the French planter class, repelled Spanish forces, expelled a British expedition army of tens of thousands, and in 1803 crushed the veteran legions that Napoleon himself had sent to restore order. On January 1st of 1804, Haiti declared independence, the first nation in history born from a successful slave revolt. It was a victory for the ages, but the cost was brutal. The war had destroyed the country's entire productive infrastructure. The plantations were in ruins. The new nation had no established trade routes, no diplomatic recognition from the world's major powers, and no capital reserves. The United States, then the largest slave-owning republic on Earth, refused to recognize Haiti for over half a century, terrified that the idea would spread. European powers followed the American lead. Haiti was born into a cordon of isolation, designed to ensure it failed. But the isolation was only beginning, because in 1825, France sent warships. This is the moment we need to pause on, because what happened in 1825 is the most important thing that most people have never heard of. King Charles X of France issued an ultimatum. Pay an indemnity of 150 million gold francs to compensate former French slave owners for the, quote, property that they had lost in the revolution. The property, of course, being the enslaved people themselves. Recognize us diplomatically and pay for your own freedom, or we invade. Haiti's president, desperate for international trade and facing a French naval fleet that he couldn't match, agreed. Subscribe to Fall of Nations if you want to understand why some nations rise while others collapse, because what comes next is one of the most important economic facts in the history of the Western Hemisphere, and we're not done yet. To make the first payment on that indemnity, Haiti was forced to borrow at punishing interest rates from both French and American banks. This created what historians now call the double debt. Reparations owed to France above, loan payments to foreign banks below. For the next 122 years, until 1947, Haiti funneled a devastating share of its national revenue to foreign creditors. At times, debt servicing consumed as much as 80% of that government budget. Think about what that means in real terms. For over a century, from the 1820s to the 1940s, the period in which the United States was building its rail network, when Europe was industrializing, when public education and healthcare were being established across the developed world, Haiti was writing checks to Paris. Every year, there was nothing left for schools, nothing for roads, nothing for hospitals, nothing for the institutions that turn a liberated people into a functioning state. France didn't just take the wealth of the plantation era. It kept taking long after the plantation was gone, and Haiti entered the 20th century already hollowed out. Meanwhile, the Dominican Republic was on a different path. Not wealthy, but unencumbered by that specific kind of debt trap. Haiti briefly occupied the entire island between 1822 and 1844, unifying it under a single government. But the eastern population revolted, and in 1844, the Dominican Republic declared independence. Both nations started the 19th century as struggling, fragile republics, but their economic instincts were already diverging. Haiti, traumatized by the memory of the plantation system, distributed land into small family plots. The impulse was understandable, even noble. Freedom meant never working on someone else's land again, but it meant that the state had almost no tax base and no export revenue. The Dominican Republic, freed from that trauma, began attracting foreign investment in sugar and coffee and tobacco. By the late 1800s, it was building trade relationships. Neither country was prosperous, but one was slowly integrating into the global economy, and the other was being slowly bled dry by it. And then came the dictators, and this is where the gap becomes a canyon. Both countries were occupied by the United States in the early 20th century. Haiti from 1915 till 1934, and the Dominican Republic from 1916 till 1924. Both occupations modernized the military, and both militaries, they eventually produced strongmen. In the Dominican Republic, Rafael Trujillo seized power in 1930 and ruled for 31 years. Trujillo was a monster. He ordered massacres. He killed political opponents. He ran state terror as a standard tool of governance. He owned, by some estimates, up to 60% of the country's GDP. He renamed the capital after himself. He was, by any historical measure, one of the most brutal dictators in all of the Americas. But he was what economists call a stationary bandit. He wasn't interested in looting and leaving. He viewed the Dominican Republic as his personal business, and a smart businessman invests in the enterprise. He built roads, power plants, bridges, schools. He modernized agriculture. He brought in foreign industry. He created a state apparatus that could actually function, because a functioning state was more valuable to him than a plundered one. In Haiti, Francois Duvalier, Papa Doc, came to power in 1957, and he made the opposite calculation entirely. Duvalier's primary concern was not building wealth, it was surviving in power. So he dismantled every institution that could threaten him. He gutted the professional military and replaced it with Tonton Macoute, which is a paramilitary loyal to him personally, paid not in salary but in the freedom to loot. He systematically purged the educated professional class, driving Haiti's doctors, lawyers, engineers, and teachers all into exile. That brain drain stripped the country of the very people that it needed most to develop. He nationalized industries, not to build them, but to hand them to cronies who could extract immediate cash and kick back a share. He killed an estimated 60,000 Haitian citizens during his reign. Where Trujillo built a country, corruptly, brutally, but structurally, Duvalier consumed one. By 1960, the GDP per capita of Haiti and the Dominican Republic was roughly equivalent. By 2005, the Dominican Republic's had tripled and Haiti's had halved. That divergence doesn't happen by accident. It's the direct output of two fundamentally different theories of power. And after the dictatorship ended, the two countries made one more defining choice. When the Dominican Republic emerged from the Trujillo era and the civil conflict that followed, its leaders made a deliberate bet on the future: tourism. In 1984, tourism revenue surpassed sugar revenue for the first time. The government had been laying the groundwork for years. Tax breaks for resort development, free trade zones for manufacturing, aggressive foreign investment laws. By the 1990s and 2000s, the Dominican Republic was transforming itself into the Caribbean's premier destination. Today, it holds roughly 24% of the entire Caribbean tourism economy. That bet, made by institutions that were still functioning, however imperfectly, paid off in generational terms. Haiti, cycling through coup, political crises, and institutional collapse throughout the same period, never made that bet. Its tourism industry, which had been actually vibrant in the 1970s, disintegrated entirely under that weight of violence and instability. Today, it's essentially non-existent. The trees tell the story before any economic data does. Look at the satellite image of Hispaniola again. That sharp green line on the eastern side and the barren brown expanse to the west. That's not natural. It's the direct result of a decision made by one government and never made by another. Joaquin Balaguer, who was Trujillo's successor, made an extraordinary environmental bet in the 1960s. He recognized that the country's agricultural and hydroelectric future depended entirely on keeping the mountain forests intact. He banned commercial logging, he deployed the military to enforce that ban, and he subsidized cheap propane gas so that poor households could still cook without cutting trees. He broke the charcoal dependency cycle before it became irreversible. But in Haiti, no one made that bet. Poverty drove charcoal production. Charcoal production drove deforestation. Deforestation stripped the mountains of topsoil, made the land less productive, and made the people poorer, which drove more charcoal cutting. A self-reinforcing spiral written in the hillsides over decades. Today, less than 1% of Haiti's primary forests remain. The Dominican Republic maintains 45% forest cover and a national park system that protects nearly a third of the country's land area. When Hurricane Jean struck both sides of the island in 2004, the numbers told the story. On the Dominican side, over 24 deaths, but on the Haitian side, over 3,000, buried under mudslides from mountains that had been stripped bare. Same storm, different trees, completely different death tolls. And then came 2010, an earthquake that killed an estimated 250,000 Haitians and displaced 1.3 million. On the other side of that same island, the Dominican Republic absorbed international relief operations without registering more than a tremor. Fast forward to now, and the gap has almost been impossible to put into numbers. In 2025, the Dominican Republic's central bank reported foreign currency inflows exceeding $47 billion from tourism, remittances, free trade zones, and foreign investment combined. Life expectancy sits at 74 years. Electricity access covers nearly the entire population. The country's building a physical border barrier to prevent gang violence from spilling east. Haiti, in early 2026, is a different reality entirely. 90% of Port-au-Prince is under gang control. Over 5,915 people were killed by armed groups in 2025 alone. 40% of health facilities closed or are non-functional. The country's main international airport faces repeated closures after aircraft were struck with gunfire. Doctors Without Borders, one of the most committed humanitarian organizations on Earth, permanently closed its emergency centers in Port-au-Prince because operating there had become too dangerous for its own staff. The Marriott closed. Banks closed. Courts largely stopped functioning. Gangs now impose transit fees on the main national highways. And the humanitarian response plan, the international effort to feed and shelter Haitian civilians caught in the crossfire, was only 24% funded by the end of 2025. The world has largely looked away. The life expectancy is 65 and a half years. That's nearly a decade shorter than just the other side of the island. So what's the lesson of Hispaniola? It's not a lesson about geography. Both sides of the island share the same mountains, the same storms, the same soil, the same tectonic plates. The 2010 earthquake didn't choose. The hurricanes didn't navigate by passport. Every natural force that Haiti has endured, the Dominican Republic has faced too. The lesson is about institutions and the choices made by the people who built them or burned them down. It's about whether a debt a nation inherited was payable or generational. About whether a dictator treated the state as a business to invest in or a treasury to rob. About whether someone decided to protect the forests before it was too late or whether no one ever did. About whether, in the decades when the world was modernizing, a country built hospitals and schools and power grids, or whether every franc that could have funded them was being wired to Paris. Haiti's path was not written by geography, it was written by the 1825 indemnity, by the Duvalier years, by the Tonton Macoute and the brain drain and the charcoal fires burning on the stripped hillsides for 100 years, and then by the assassination of a president in 2021 that no functioning institution was strong enough to survive. Every one of those moments was a human decision, or the failure to make one in time. The border on Hispaniola is not a natural feature. It's a monument to the accumulated weight of human choices. Green on one side, brown on the other. Geography set the stage, but it was the institutions built on that land, and the ones that were never built, and the ones that were deliberately destroyed, that determined whether a nation rose into prosperity or fell into chaos. Hispaniola proves it more clearly than anywhere else on Earth. So we want to know what you think. Is Haiti's collapse reversible at this point, or has the damage to the institutions, forests, to the social fabric gone too deep to come back from? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe to Fall of Nations, because this is exactly the kind of story that this channel exists to tell.